train in the house. Woo! Looks like we've got some angels in the crowd tonight. Well, that's great, because I've got something I've got to say.
Have you ever prayed for something with your whole heart and heard nothing? No answer, no signs, no miracle, no explanations, just silence? You prayed for healing, silence. You prayed for relationships to be restored, silence. You prayed for the pain to stop, silence. Now, after a while, a question begins to form. God, are you even listening? Because sometimes God's silence can almost hurt as much as the thing you're praying about. Especially when the wound was caused by another person. Especially when someone betrayed you. They've lied to you. They've abused you. They walked away and they left the scar. They left scars. They never had to carry themselves. And that's where many people get stuck. Not only in the pain, but in the waiting for God to fix it. Waiting for justice, waiting for an apology that never comes. Waiting for the person who hurt them to finally understand what they did. I think one of the hardest truths we face in this is some people will never give you the closure you deserve. Some people will never say sorry, and some people will never understand the damage they caused you. Some people will never take responsibility, and if your healing it depends on them doing those things, you've handed them the keys to your future and your heart. That's a painful realization, but it's also an empowering one, because healing begins when we stop waiting for someone else to become who they should be and start becoming who we were meant to be. Now, before we go any further, let's clear something up. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood words in spirituality. Forgiveness does not mean what happened was okay. Forgiveness does not mean justice doesn't matter. And forgiveness does not mean trust is automatically restored. Forgiveness does not mean allowing someone to continue hurting you. And forgiveness certainly does not mean pretending the wound never existed. Not at all. In fact, sometimes forgiveness begins by fully acknowledging how much it hurt, because what is buried cannot be healed, and what is denied cannot be transformed. And what is ignored often becomes a wound that quietly, it shapes our lives. I believe many people think forgiveness is something we do for the other person, but often forgiveness is something we do for ourselves. We need to do for ourselves, because resentment is heavy, anger is heavy, bitterness is heavy, and carrying them for years can become its own prison. The person who hurt you may have moved on, yet part of your heart remains chained to the moment it happened. Forgiveness is not saying you didn't hurt me. Forgiveness is saying you hurt me deeply, but I refuse to let this pain define the rest of my life. That is strength, that is courage, that is freedom. But let's talk about boundaries, because boundaries are not the opposite of forgiveness. No way. Boundaries are often an expression of wisdom. You can forgive someone and never lend them money again. You can forgive someone and never give them the same access to your heart again. And you can forgive someone and still say, this behavior is not welcome in my life. Many people confuse forgiveness with reconciliation, but reconciliation requires two people, and forgiveness only one is required. God may ask you to forgive, but God does not ask you to abandon wisdom. If someone repeatedly harms you, manipulates you, lies to you, or abuses your trust, a boundary is not hatred. A boundary is love with self-respect. And perhaps that is where God's silence becomes interesting. Because maybe God isn't always silent. Maybe sometimes God is speaking in ways we just don't expect. Sometimes through a feeling, sometimes through wisdom, and sometimes through a quiet voice inside that says, enough, walk away, protect your peace, stop trying to save someone who doesn't want to change. Choose yourself too. Not every answer from God arrives as a miracle, and sometimes it arrives as clarity, sometimes it arrives as courage, and sometimes it arrives as the strength to release what you've been carrying. I often think about what forgiveness really means, and perhaps it means refusing to become what hurt you, refusing to let someone else's darkness become your identity. refusing to allow betrayal to turn you bitter, refusing to allow cruelty to turn you cruel, refusing to allow hatred to teach you how to hate. Because then the wound would continue its journey through the world, and forgiveness stops that journey. It says to the pain, this ends. This is the sacred work. It ends. So if you've been waiting for an apology, if you've been waiting for justice, if you've been waiting for God to explain everything, I understand. Many of us have stood there. But perhaps healing begins when we stop waiting for the perfect ending and begin choosing peace anyway. Not because what happened was acceptable. No. Not because the wound wasn't real, but because your heart deserves freedom. And maybe that's what God wants for you too. Not a life without scars, but a life where your scars no longer control your future. A life where wisdom replaces bitterness. A life where boundaries replace fear. A life where forgiveness becomes a doorway back to peace. My name is Rain, and this is All Souls Gathering, where every soul matters, where your questions matter, where your healing matters, and where the focus is always on the weight in your heart. And if no one has told you lately, you're allowed to heal. You're allowed to forgive. You're allowed to create boundaries. And you are allowed to move forward carrying less pain than you carried yesterday. Because that light within you, that love within you, that part of you that still wants peace is worth protecting. And perhaps that is God's quiet voice after all that noise.